Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you.
Welcome to Harmony Glades. Bernice Abernathy clipped a faded bloom from her prize piece rose, the snick of steel a crisp counterpoint to the hushed morning. Diamond-like dew clung to the blades of her immaculate lawn, each standing rigidly erect. Harmony Glades was her realm, and she, its queen, a velvet-gloved autocrat whose saccharine smile could sour cream. Straightening, a familiar twinge needled her lower back as she surveyed her meticulously crafted idol. Mrs. Henderson's petunias needed some bolstering, a discreet note on the matter seemed appropriate. The Johnsons' mailbox tilted at a rakish angle, a gentle nudge back to verticality was surely in order. Then she spied an enormous moving van, a metal behemoth, had the audacity to squat before number 14, her next-door neighbor. Bernice's lips compressed. Number 14's prolonged vacancy had been a persistent disquiet. Who now dared to invade the carefully balanced ecosystem she'd labored to create? She observed, azure eyes narrowed behind the shield of her outsized sunglasses as a family erupted from the vehicle. A young couple, their laughter buoyant on the crisp air. Children, miniature dynamos chasing one another across the untamed grass, and were those dreadlocks cascading down someone's back? Bernice adjusted her sunglasses, a hard knot forming in her solar plexus. This was unforeseen. She sought refuge within the cool embrace of her kitchen, the tang of lemon polish a dependable solace. A phone call was essential. Ethel, dear, she cooed into the phone, her voice laced with honeyed southern charm. You simply cannot imagine what's unfolding. They've arrived next door. The Millers, I believe, and well, let's just say they're introducing a certain energy to our quiet corner. A strategic pause allowed Ethel to connect the dots. She knew Ethel would comprehend. Precisely, darling, Bernice continued, her voice dropping to a hushed confidence. Children running riot, music, of a distinctly different flavor, if you catch my meaning. And Ethel, I swear I witnessed a grill rivaling my gazebo in magnitude. Imagine the smoke, consider the property values, my dear, consider the property values. She absorbed Ethel's sympathetic murmurs, a small, self-satisfied curve gracing her lips. She had allies. She wasn't alone in guarding the gates. Later, Bernice found herself coincidentally irrigating her hydrangeas near the boundary line. Strategically positioned to observe the Millers in action, the husband, a broad-shouldered fellow radiating an amiable disposition, was engaged in a wrestling match with a trampoline. The wife, her hair a vibrant cascade of braids, was unloading cartons with focused efficiency. The children, still brimming with kinetic energy, were transforming the pavement into a kaleidoscope of chalk creations. Bernice observed, her initial apprehension gradually crystallizing into something sharper, resentment. They were so unrestrained. So joyously oblivious. It was a jarring juxtaposition to the tranquil, governed ambience she had fostered in Harmony Glades. As dusk descended, Bernice resolved to act. Bearing a freshly baked lemon cake like a peace offering, she traversed the manicured expanse of her lawn, her smile firmly affixed. Welcome to Harmony Glades, she sang, presenting the cake to Mrs. Miller, whom she'd learned was named Sarah. I'm Bernice Abernathy, your neighbor. I simply wish to offer a token to ease your transition. Sarah's smile was radiant, sincere. Thank you so much, Mrs. Abernathy. That's remarkably kind. Please call me Sarah. Bernice gained entry, her gaze subtly cataloging the contents of the living room, the slightly mismatched furniture, the vibrant rug anchoring the space, the stack of literature by Black authors upon the coffee table. Everything was divergent. This is a charming residence, Bernice commented, her tone just a hair too saccharine. Naturally, Harmony Glades maintains certain standards. We pride ourselves on upholding a particular aesthetic. She extended a vague gesture toward the verdant perfection outside. The HOA guidelines are quite precise regarding landscaping, exterior palettes, decibel levels. I'm certain you'll discover them within your welcome packet. Sarah nodded courteously, her expression carefully neutral. We'll certainly give them a read, she replied. As Bernice prepared to depart, she lingered in the threshold, a final dart tossed with a sugared smile, just a spot of neighborly counsel. Dear, the HOA is rather fastidious about garden ornaments. Gnomes are verboten. Back inside her own meticulously ordered kitchen, Bernice poured herself a glass of sweet tea, the sweetness doing little to temper the acrid taste within her mouth. The Millers were a weed in her carefully cultivated garden, and weeds, she knew, must be eradicated before they strangled the life from everything. She merely needed to determine the appropriate herbicide, and she suspected she knew exactly where to begin her search. The Millers settle in. The rhythmic clatter of the keyboard was Marcus's shield. a familiar sound against the swirling chaos of unpacking. He leaned back in his borrowed office chair, the lumbar support digging uncomfortably into his spine. He needed to order a proper one, add it to the growing list. His gaze drifted from the spreadsheets blurring on his laptop screen to the boxes stacked precariously in the corner of the spare bedroom, their cardboard flaps groaning under the strain. Balancing a demanding project at work with the demands of settling in was proving to be a Herculean task that he rubbed his tired eyes. A knot of tension tightening between his shoulder blades, another Zoom meeting loomed. Another hour of trying to sound enthusiastic while battling the faint but persistent scent of furniture polish that Sarah was so fond of downstairs. Sarah hummed a cheerful tune as she carefully arranged a vase of sunflowers on the kitchen table. The vibrant yellow blooms were a stark contrast to the sterile white walls, a splash of sunshine in their still unfamiliar surroundings. She stepped back, tilting her head, a critical eye assessing her handiwork. The house was slowly transforming from an empty shell into a home. Curtains went up, rugs were laid, and the scent of freshly baked cookies wafted from the oven. A deliberate attempt to infuse the place with warmth and welcome that IT was her domain. Her way of making their mark, of planting roots in this new soil that she'd even managed to coax Marcus into hanging. The gallery wall in the living room, a collection of family photos that whispered stories of laughter, love, and shared memories. The school bus rumbled to a halt outside, its brakes sighing like an old man. Maya and David tumbled out, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, their faces a mixture of relief and something else Sarah couldn't quite decipher as they walked up the driveway. She noticed the way Maya pulled David closer, a protective gesture that tugged at her heart. "How was school?" she asked, her voice deliberately bright. Maya shrugged, kicking a loose pebble across the driveway. "Okay, I guess." David, usually brimming with stories, remained uncharacteristically quiet. He avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the scuff marks on his new sneakers later. After dinner, Sarah gently probed. Maya eventually admitted that some of the kids had been asking questions about her hair, about her skin, about where they were really from. Microaggressions, subtle jabs masked as curiosity, but cutting nonetheless. David, younger and more sensitive, had simply been ignored, left out of games. His attempts to join in met with dismissive shrugs. Sarah listened, her heart aching, her fists clenching. She remembered her own childhood experiences, the sting of being the other, and a wave of protectiveness washed over her. That weekend, the Millers decided to host a small welcome dinner. Sarah prepared a feast of Southern comfort food, her grandmother's recipes filling the house with the aroma of fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet potato pie. Marcus fired up the grill, the scent of charcoal mingling with the savory smells emanating from the kitchen. They invited a few of the neighbors they'd briefly met, a motley crew of retirees, young families, and solitary figures. The evening was a resounding success, or so it seemed. Laughter spilled out onto the patio, the clinking of glasses punctuated by animated conversations. Marcus, ever the gregarious host, effortlessly charmed their guests with his easygoing manner and self-deprecating humor. Sarah, radiant in a floral dress, flitted between the kitchen and the patio, ensuring everyone had enough to eat and drink. Even Maya and David, initially hesitant, seemed to relax, drawn into a game of charades with some of the younger children as the evening drew to a close and the last of the guests departed. Sarah stood on the porch, watching their taillights disappear down the street. She wrapped her arms around Marcus, a deep breath filling her lungs. "It went well, don't you think?" Marcus squeezed her shoulder, his smile warm and reassuring. "It was perfect. Honey, we're going to be happy here." Unseen, from behind the lace-curtained window of a nearby house, Bernice watched them, her face a mask of simmering resentment. The sounds of their laughter, the sight of their easy camaraderie, only fueled her growing animosity. The Millers' happiness was a direct affront to her, a glaring reminder of everything she felt she was losing. The seed of her plan, already planted, began to sprout in the fertile ground of her prejudice, whispers and complaints. The morning dew still clung to the grass, making the blades glisten like tiny emeralds, but Bernice Abernathy wasn't admiring the beauty. She was crouched, her floral-printed housecoat brushing against the damp earth, her phone held inches from the Miller's lawn. Click, click, click. Each photo captured a minuscule imperfection, a rogue dandelion stubbornly blooming, a slightly overgrown patch near the sidewalk, the wayward sprinkler head angled a few degrees off kilter. Amateur hour, she muttered, her breath misting in the cool air. Their landscaping was a disgrace, an affront to the manicured perfection she'd cultivated in Harmony Glades for 20 years. It wasn't just the weeds. It was the carelessness of it all. A lack of respect. Later that week, the HOA meeting felt different. Bernice had strategically placed herself next to Mildred Henderson, whose penchant for gossip rivaled her love of geraniums. "Did you see their garbage cans last Tuesday?" Bernice whispered, leaning in conspiratorially. "Out on the curb a full day early. Honestly, some people just don't understand the rules." Mildred, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and disapproval, clucked her tongue. "It sets a bad example, Bernice. A very bad example." The meeting droned on, filled with debates about mailbox colors and acceptable pet breeds, but Bernice subtly steered the conversation towards the Millers. She didn't directly accuse them of anything, of course, that would be uncouth. Instead, she posed questions. Shouldn't we be vigilant about maintaining property values, and are we all committed to upholding the standards that make Harmony Glades so desirable? Each question was a tiny seed of doubt planted in the minds of her neighbors. The first letter arrived on the Millers' doorstep a week later. A bland, officially worded notice about overgrown grass exceeding the HOA's 3-inch limit. Marcus chuckled, thinking it was a joke. He'd mowed the lawn just last weekend. He chalked it up to bureaucratic error and promptly forgot about it. Then came the second letter, more sternly worded, citing a violation regarding the placement of their recycling bins. This time, Marcus frowned. He'd always placed the bins exactly where the previous owners had. He made a mental note to double-check the HOA guidelines. The third letter arrived a week after that, registered mail, detailing a complaint about excessive noise from their children playing in the backyard. This one stung. His kids were just being kids. He knew they weren't being excessively loud. That evening, simmering with a slow burn of frustration, Marcus walked across the street to Bernice's meticulously kept home. Her hydrangeas were blooming in a riot of blue and pink, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to his growing unease. Bernice answered the door with a practiced smile, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "Marcus, isn't it? What a pleasant surprise." "Mrs. Abernathy," Marcus said, forcing a smile of his own. "I was hoping to have a quick chat. We've been receiving some letters from the HOA, and frankly, they seem a little excessive. About the lawn, the garbage cans, even the kids playing. I just wanted to understand what's going on." Bernice's smile didn't waver. "Oh, the HOA," she said, a delicate flutter of her hand dismissing the entire organization. "They can be a bit overzealous at times. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Perhaps you should review the community guidelines. They're available on the website." "I plan to," Marcus replied, his voice carefully neutral. "But these complaints seem personal. Have you perhaps noticed anything that might be bothering you? Anything we can do to be better neighbors?" Bernice tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Marcus, dear, I only want what's best for Harmony Glades. We all do. Maintaining our standards is crucial. I'm sure you understand." Her voice dripped with a saccharine sweetness that left a bitter taste in Marcus's mouth. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend." She closed the door with a soft click, leaving Marcus standing on her perfectly swept porch, the scent of her fragrant hydrangeas hanging heavy in the air. He knew, with a growing certainty, that this was far from over. Escalation. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated Bernice's face, highlighting the sharp angles of her jaw. Hours she'd spent hunched over, scrolling through the HOA's Byzantine website, her eyes scanning for anything she could weaponize against the Millers. Page after page of meticulously worded bylaws swam before her eyes, a legalistic labyrinth she was determined to navigate. Section 3, Subsection B, Paragraph 14, Landscaping Requirements, she muttered, circling the passage with a manicured nail. Grass must be kept trimmed to a maximum of 3 inches. She envisioned the Miller's yard, admittedly a little shaggy compared to her own perfectly manicured lawn, and a grim satisfaction tightened her lips. She minimized the browser and grabbed her phone, dialing Mildred. "Mildred, darling, you won't believe the state of their yard. It's an eyesore. And you know how sensitive the HOA is about property values." Mildred's voice, a low, conspiratorial hum, crackled through the speaker. "Oh, Bernice, you're absolutely right. We can't let standards slip. Remember what happened with the Rodriguez family. Their peeling paint brought down everyone's property values." Bernice bristled, a familiar heat rising in her chest. The Rodriguez family. That had been years ago, before her arthritis truly set in. when she could still prune her roses with the best of them. The Rodriguez family had dared to paint their house a gaudy shade of turquoise. Turquoise! An abomination. She gently encouraged them to reconsider, pointing out the HOA guidelines, of course, but they hadn't listened. They hadn't understood the importance of maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetic. Harmony. They'd moved out shortly after. Exactly, Mildred. It's about upholding standards. I'm thinking a formal complaint to the HOA is in order. Perhaps several. Bernice tapped her pen against the desk, a predatory gleam in her eye. And if that doesn't work, well, there are other avenues to explore. The other avenues were swirling in her mind, a dark and unsettling vortex. The strategically placed anonymous tip about suspicious activity at the Miller's address. The carefully worded email to the HOA board highlighting the unusual comings and goings at their house, with a subtle suggestion of code violations. Or perhaps, she hesitated, a shiver of something akin to guilt momentarily flickering across her face. Perhaps something a bit more direct. She remembered the garden center, the rows of perfectly labeled plants, the discreet section in the back dedicated to less savory options. The thought of it, the power it represented, sent a thrill through her. She shook her head, trying to regain control. No, not yet. That was too drastic, too risky. But the seed had been planted. Bernice closed her laptop with a snap. The Millers were a weed in her otherwise perfect garden. And weeds, she knew, needed to be eradicated. She stood and walked over to the window, peering through the pristine glass at the Miller's house across the street. The light was on in the kitchen. She could see a silhouette moving inside, a dark shape against the warm glow, a shape that didn't belong. Suddenly, she remembered Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning petunias, decimated overnight by some sort of insidious blight. Mrs. Henderson had sworn it was deliberate. Bernice had dismissed it then, but now she wasn't so sure. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The game had only just begun, and Bernice Abernathy was determined to win. A desperate plan. Bernice drummed manicured fingertips on the steering wheel, the pleather seat clinging uncomfortably to her damp thigh. The rendezvous, tucked behind the derelict gas station, stank of desperation laced with old gasoline. She'd swallowed a bitter draught of pride, crossing into the city's neglected quadrant, all to secure the small packet nestled in her handbag. The dealer, a jittery youth whose eyes flicked like startled birds, simply took the money and gestured towards a corroded dumpster. Back. Inside the sterile bubble of her SUV, the faint, pungent aroma of cannabis permeated the air. A distasteful necessity, a surgical tool for her precise operation. The Millers had to be evicted, metaphorically speaking, their garish basketball hoop, music that pulsed through the tranquil cul-de-sac. Their sheer existence felt like an invasive weed choking Willow Creek estates. They were an anomaly. Sunset bled across the sky in shades of violet and fiery ochre as she cruised past the Millers' residence. She slowed, pretending interest in Mrs. Miller's paltry rose bushes, a garden so inferior to her own it was almost insulting. Tonight was the enactment. Her gaze swept the Millers' property. The roses were too obvious, as was the gangly tomato patch. She needed subtlety there. Hidden behind the riotous hydrangea, a small patch of denuded earth lay concealed from casual view, ideal sheltered, readily accessible from the side yard, and unlikely to attract unwanted attention. The subsequent hours became a blur of meticulous strategizing. First, the airtight alibi. Book club convened at 7:30, adjourning promptly at 9. At ample time to slip away, deposit the evidence, and return unfettered. She would even contribute a thoughtful analysis of the protagonist's flawed character, solidifying her presence and credibility. Next, the circuitous route. She would park 2 streets away, beyond the reach of watchful eyes and surveillance systems. Dark attire, a baseball cap casting her face in shadow, and gloves were essential. 0 tolerance for fingerprints. Bernice even rehearsed her gait, perfecting a casual saunter, projecting the image of a woman leisurely walking her dog. Inside, a volcanic resentment rumbled beneath Bernice's polished facade. They flaunted their otherness, their audacity, their belonging, like a deliberate provocation. Their laughter carried on the breeze, the exotic spices drifting from their kitchen. It was an assault on the established protocol, the very essence of Willow Creek. Asterisk, they think they can just waltz in and rewrite the rules. Asterisk, she fumed inwardly, her jaw muscles contracting. Asterisk, they believe the guidelines don't apply to them. Asterisk. She reframed her impending actions as vital defense that IT wasn't bigotry. Not really. IT was safeguarding standards, conserving property values, preserving serenity. The Millers, with their unsettling habits, threatened that equilibrium, and if a modicum of incentive was required to restore the balance, she would provide it. BY10. The plan was imprinted on her mind. She scrutinized her reflection, smoothing a stray strand of hair and adjusting her pearls. The book club had been a complete success. Everyone remarked on the acuity of her observations. Suspicion was non-existent. Now, the execution. Bernice extracted the packet from its clandestine niche, her digits betraying her with a slight tremor. She slid on the gloves, the latex uncomfortably slick against her skin. A surge of queasiness threatened to overwhelm her, a nauseating cocktail of apprehension and self-loathing. She suppressed it. This was for the welfare of the community. This was for Willow Creek. Drawing a bolstering breath, she stole into the night, a furtive silhouette slipping through the blackness, compelled by a desperate scheme. The cool air offered little solace against the consuming fire inside as she crept through the dark. The destiny of Willow Creek, in her distorted perception, hung precariously on her actions and the success of this clandestine endeavor, under the cover of darkness. The grandfather clock in the hall told midnight, its deep resonance muffled by the heavy drapes Bernice had meticulously arranged. A shard of moonlight, like a clandestine note, breached the gloom, spotlighting the package at her feet, surprisingly weighty. It exuded a sharp reek of cannabis, a scent that clawed its way through plastic and fabric. Her pulse quickened, a frantic flutter against the stillness within the walls. Bernice had mentally staged this clandestine act countless times. Each potential squeak of the floorboards, every elongated shadow thrown by passing cars, was filed away in her memory. She moved with ingrained caution, a wraith navigating her own dwelling down the staircase. Her soles muted on the plush carpet, then toward the rear exit, its hinges emitting a faint, metallic groan that stopped her cold. She paused, breath held, until the sound dissipated into the inky blackness. The night air struck her skin, chilled and humid, carrying the clean fragrance of damp foliage and night-blooming jasmine. A stark contrast to the turbulent heat raging within her. The Miller's home stood silhouetted in the distance, its unlit windows projecting an image of placid suburban life. Bernice, however, knew a different truth. Behind its stucco facade dwelled something nameless, yet perilous, that threatened to unravel her neatly ordered existence. The trek across the manicured lawns became a trial of nerves. Each rustle in the undergrowth, each cricket's trill, resonated. Like a warning siren in her skull, she crept along the perimeter of her property, before stooping low, worming her way beneath the tangled forsythia separating her domain from the Millers. The thorny branches raked at her exposed skin, leaving angry welts, yet she dared not utter a sound. The Miller's garden presented an untamed riot of verdant growth and flamboyant blossoms, a world apart from her own fastidiously maintained lawn. It was this very unruliness that so deeply offended her. Sensibilities. Motion-sensing lights, strategically positioned, cast elongated, searching swathes of illumination. Bernice flowed like a phantom, hugging the flower beds, her gaze darting, alert to any disturbance. At last, she arrived at her destination. A freshly disturbed patch of earth adjacent to the rear boundary fence, where the Millers apparently intended to cultivate vegetables. Impeccable. With trembling fingers, she excavated a shallow depression, the cool soil clinging to her skin. The parcel felt immense, burdened with its forbidden payload. She tore it open, the stench of marijuana now overwhelming, and emptied the contents into the cavity. Her digits clumsy, she shoveled dirt over the stash, smoothing the surface to simulate undisturbed ground. A sudden sound jolted her. A dog barked in the distance, its staccato cries piercing the tranquility. She froze, her heart a trapped bird fluttering wildly. Had she been detected? Was she compromised? She waited, straining her ears, until the canine outcry diminished. With a final, desperate smoothing of the earth, she crawled back through the forsythia, her attire ripped, her frame aching. Back inside her sanctuary, she shed her soiled garments, tossing them into the washing machine. She abraded her hands with harsh soap, attempting to obliterate the trace of soil, the essence of cannabis, the taint of her transgression. She incinerated the empty sack in the hearth, watching the tendrils of flame consume the remnants of her deed. The pungent fumes billowed into the room, irritating her eyes and constricting her throat. She coughed, tears streaking her cheeks from the smoke or the weight of culpability. As the first pale streaks of daylight filtered through the drapes, Bernice slumped onto her bed, depleted and quivering that it was done. The gears were set in motion soon. The Millers would be evicted, and her sphere of existence would be secure once more. Yet, as she succumbed to slumber, a persistent uncertainty gnawed at her. What if she had been observed? What if exposure loomed? The quiet of the house seemed only to intensify the frantic thrum of her pulse, a perpetual memento of the shadows she had embraced. The raid. The phone felt clammy in Bernice's hand. She glanced at the beige walls of her immaculate kitchen, each appliance gleaming, a testament to order and control. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the non-emergency line. "Yes," she said, her voice a carefully constructed tremor of concern. "I'd like to report a disturbance at the Miller residence, number 14 Willow Creek, that I've noticed some unusual activity. Late night comings and goings, unfamiliar vehicles. I'm worried something illegal might be happening there. For the children, you understand." She paused, adding a touch of breathy anxiety. "I'd prefer to remain anonymous, if you don't mind. Just doing my civic duty." The next morning, the normalcy of Willow Creek was shattered. Marcus was wrestling with the overgrown rose bushes, humming a cheerful tune, when he heard the screech of tires. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and saw 2 police cruisers pull up to his curb, lights flashing, paint gleaming menacingly in the morning sun. A black SUV followed close behind. "What in the—" he muttered, dropping his gardening shears. 4 officers emerged, their expressions grim. 1. A woman with steely eyes approached Marcus. "Marcus Miller?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth. "We have a warrant to search your property." "Stand aside." The world tilted on its axis. "A warrant? Search my property. What for?" Marcus stammered, his easygoing nature dissolving into bewildered panic before he could process the situation. Another officer led a German shepherd, its leash taut, towards the garden. The dog, a powerful animal with focused intensity, began sniffing, its nose twitching, weaving through the rows of vegetables Maya had lovingly planted. Chaos erupted. Maya rushed out of the house, her face etched with fear, their 2 children clinging to her legs, their eyes wide with confusion. "What's going on, Marcus? What are they doing?" The K9 unit circled the rose bushes Marcus had been tending. Suddenly, the dog stopped, its body rigid, its bark sharp and insistent. The handler immediately pulled the dog back and began digging where it had indicated. Within seconds, he unearthed a small package wrapped in plastic. He opened it and held it out for the other officers to see. A white, powdery substance. "Marijuana," the woman officer stated flatly. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "That's not— we don't know anything about that," Maya gasped, pulling the children closer. "Drugs? In our garden? This is insane." The officers began a thorough search of the property, turning over flower pots, rummaging through the shed, their movements methodical and invasive. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Carlos, who lived across the street, watched the scene unfold. His stomach churning, he couldn't hear what was being said, but the sight of the police swarming the Millers' property, the faces of Marcus and Maya, contorted in disbelief, filled him with a profound sense of unease. Something felt terribly wrong. The woman officer approached Marcus and Maya, her expression unwavering. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, you are being detained for questioning. We need to understand how these narcotics ended up on your property." "Detained?" Marcus's voice cracked. "But we're innocent. This has to be a mistake." He looked around at the gawking neighbors, their faces a blur of rubbernecking. Humiliation washed over him, a bitter tide threatening to drown him. "We're not going anywhere without a lawyer," Maya stated firmly, her voice trembling but resolute. She pulled out her cell phone, her fingers fumbling with the keys. As the police continued their search, Marcus's gaze fell on Bernice's house across the street. The curtains twitched. He couldn't be sure, but he thought he saw a fleeting glimpse of her face behind the glass. A shiver ran down his spine, a cold premonition that this was no accident. The camera never lies. The blinking red light of the security console mocked Carlos. He scrubbed a hand over his stubbled chin, the grit a familiar comfort in the face of rising anxiety. Last night's raid had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. The Millers, dragged out in their pajamas, the frantic barking of the dog, the sheer, brutal efficiency of the police presence, it had all felt wrong. Now, hunched over the monitor in his dimly lit study, he fast-forwarded through the grainy footage. The wind rustled the overgrown hedges along the property line, casting dancing shadows that made it difficult to see. He slowed the playback, focusing on the Miller's garden, a splash of green against the manicured lawns of the other houses. He zoomed in, pixelating the image further but revealing more detail. There. A figure, cloaked in darkness, slipping through the gap in the fence. Carlos squinted, adjusting the contrast. The figure moved with a furtive grace, placing something near the base of the rose bushes. His breath hitched. He zoomed in further, the image now a blocky mosaic, but there was no mistaking the distinctive silhouette, the way she held her head, the unmistakable sway of her hips. Bernice. A wave of disbelief washed over him, followed by a hot surge of anger. Bernice, the HOA president, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood's pristine image. Bernice, planting drugs in the Miller's garden. The camera never lies. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. This was complicated. He wasn't a confrontational person. He preferred the quiet hum of his computer to the shouting matches that often erupted at HOA meetings. Getting involved meant stepping into a hornet's nest, exposing himself to Bernice's wrath, the disapproval of the other neighbors, maybe even legal repercussions. He could almost feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on him, but the image on the screen, frozen now, refused to let him off the hook. He pictured the Millers, their faces etched with fear and humiliation. He imagined their dog, cowering in the corner. He thought about the injustice of it all, the sheer audacity of Bernice's actions. He minimized the video, opening a fresh document on his computer. He typed, deleted, and retyped, trying to articulate his thoughts, his fears, his growing sense of obligation. He closed the document, unsent. Words wouldn't do. This required proof. He spent the next hour meticulously editing the video. He cropped the frame, focusing solely on Bernice's actions. He enhanced the image, sharpening the details without compromising its integrity. He added a timestamp, a silent witness to her deception. Finally, he was satisfied. He uploaded the video to a secure file-sharing service, generating a unique, encrypted link. He opened a new email account using a disposable address and a randomized name. He pasted the link into the body of a short, anonymous message. Evidence of illegal activity at 14 Oak Street. Please investigate. His fingers hovered over the send button. This was it, the point of no return. He took a deep breath and clicked. The email vanished into the digital ether, carrying with it the weight of his decision. He shut down his computer, the screen fading to black. He felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. He'd done the right thing, he knew that, but he also knew that the storm was just beginning. He just hoped he hadn't exposed himself, his family, to something he couldn't control. He looked out the window into the dark, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel safe in his own home. He needed to be more vigilant, to watch his back. Bernice wasn't going to take this lying down. Justice served. The two officers sat across from Bernice in her meticulously decorated living room, the floral wallpaper clashing violently with the steely glint in their eyes. Detective Reynolds, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, held a tablet displaying the security footage. Bernice, perched on the edge of her antique chaise lounge, dabbed nervously at her forehead with a lace handkerchief. Mrs. Abernathy, Reynolds began, her voice devoid of warmth. This video clearly shows you entering the Miller's property late at night. Can you explain what you were doing? Bernice's carefully constructed facade began to crack. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not me. She waved her hand dismissively, a diamond ring flashing. The lighting is terrible. Anyone could look like that. Detective Miller, a younger man with a patient tone, leaned forward. Mrs. Abernathy, we enhanced the image. We also spoke with the security company. They confirmed the camera is functioning perfectly and that the individual in the video matches your description and is wearing the same jewelry you are wearing today. Bernice's eyes darted around the room, seeking an escape route that didn't exist. Her initial defiance crumbled into a nervous tremor. It's a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. Reynolds pressed on, her voice unwavering. We found traces of the narcotics on your gardening gloves, Mrs. Abernathy, the same narcotics that were planted in the Miller's garden. Silence hung heavy in the air, punctuated only by Bernice's shallow breaths. Finally, she cracked. It was for the good of the community, she stammered, her voice laced with a desperate plea for understanding. They don't belong here. They're different. They bring down the property values. Different how, Mrs. Abernathy? Detective Miller asked, his voice dangerously soft. Bernice's carefully constructed world of prejudice and privilege spilled out in a torrent of hateful words. She spoke of her fear of change, her discomfort with the Millers' culture, and her conviction that they were somehow inferior. The officers listened, their faces grim, as she revealed the ugly truth that had been festering beneath the surface of her genteel facade. Marcus and Keisha Miller were at the park with their children when Detective Reynolds called. She asked them to come to the station. Keisha felt a wave of dread wash over her. She squeezed Marcus's hand, her knuckles white. At the station, Reynolds told them everything. Bernice's confession, the video evidence, the matching narcotics. Marcus stared blankly, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with a cold fury. Keisha simply wept, tears of relief and rage streaming down her face. They were exonerated. Bernice Abernathy was under arrest. News of Bernice's confession spread through the community like wildfire. Some residents expressed outrage, appalled by her actions and her racist motivations. Others remained silent, uncomfortable with the exposure of the prejudice that had been simmering beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic neighborhood. Carlos Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing the situation, felt a surge of conviction. He knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He printed out copies of the security footage and posted them on the community bulletin board, along with a statement condemning Bernice's actions and calling for unity and understanding. He felt a little sick doing it. It was so unlike him. The HOA, facing mounting pressure from the community and the media, announced a series of reforms designed to address discriminatory practices. They promised to review their bylaws, implement diversity training for board members, and establish a system for reporting and investigating complaints of bias. It was a start, but Marcus and Keisha knew that true change would require more than just policy updates. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, Carlos Rodriguez stood on the Miller's doorstep, a peace offering in hand. It wasn't flowers or a casserole, but a collection of rare succulents from his own garden, a symbol of resilience and growth. "I'm sorry for what happened," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "We should have done more." Marcus, his anger tempered by a glimmer of hope, smiled and extended his hand. "Thank you, Carlos. It means a lot." As they stood there, talking about plants and neighborhoods, the Millers felt a small measure of peace. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were no longer alone. They had found an ally in an unexpected place, a quiet, observant neighbor who had finally found his voice. The fight for justice had been won, but the battle for true acceptance had just begun. Bernice Abernathy would face legal repercussions and social ostracism. But the real challenge lay in dismantling the system that had allowed her prejudice to flourish in the first place.